Speaking about Charlottesville last week, I was very annoyed with a media that flocks to condemn political violence from white nationalists or white supremacists or neo-Nazis or whatever you want to call them and whatever they may be, but routinely refuses to condemn political violence from left-wing groups like BAM or Black Lives Matter or, of course, Antifa. And I'm not annoyed because I like one group and dislike the other. I'm annoyed by the lack of consistency. I'm annoyed because we should oppose political violence on principle, not based on ideology or allegiance. And I was frustrated enough by media simply ignoring the near weekly reality of mostly mainstream American political opinion being violently stifled by a band of masked degenerates given an inexplicable pass to disregard everything America stands for: individual rights and the rule of law. But if there's one thing more annoying than ignoring injustice, it's actively praising it. Some outlets have dipped toes into the pool of Antifa praise, and some have jumped off the high dive. Yahoo described Antifa as a force that has emerged to fight the Nazis, a natural reaction to the politically unacceptable ideologies gaining momentum, enabled by Donald Trump. The New York Times gave Moldylocks a photo much more professional and glamorous than many of the other ones you can find on the internet, quoting her saying, "You need violence in order to protect non-violence. That's what's very obviously necessary right now. It's a full-on war, basically." A CNN headline said much the same thing, originally describing Antifa as seeking peace through violence. But after Antifa themselves didn't like being characterized as violent, CNN dropped the subtitle and the headline now only reads, "Unmasking the leftist Antifa movement." Odd to say you're unmasking them when you're actually giving them cover, but hey, speaking of CNN, Chris Cuomo and others likened D-Day veterans to Antifa fighting white supremacists, which is not only outrageous for comparing the courage of the American service member to the cowardice of a masked criminal, but is historically illiterate as well. Fighting white supremacism was not the reason the US entered the war, and it's hard to square that purpose with the facts of the time. That the US refused Jewish refugees from Europe, that the US interned Japanese citizens, that the US military was still racially segregated. I don't say that for shaming purposes, I say that because that's just the way US history unfolded. I say that so Chris Cuomo knows he's not only
very fake news,
he's very fake history too. And the Washington Post featured an article from a Dartmouth professor suggesting maybe we should start listening to Antifa. After all, they are demographically diverse, and us silly white people should recognize that. This professor's name is Mark Bray. He's just released a new book called The Anti-Fascist Handbook, and on Sunday, he appeared on Meet the Press with Chuck Todd.
Mark Bray is a Dartmouth professor who has studied the Antifa anti-fascist movement. Antifa is a far-left political movement that argues it's necessary to confront hate groups, sometimes with force. Professor Bray is author of the new book, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook.
Antifa? What the hell is Antifa? Oh, you don't know her? She's married to Uncle Fa. Oh, right. That chick. This is the big question with mainstream media figures. Are they playing dumb, or do they actually not know what Antifa is? If you know that Antifa is short for anti-fascist as you describe, then how do you call it Antifa? Bunch of anti-intellectuals. Anyway, to give you an idea of just how crazy Mark Bray is, Meet the Press brought on Richard Cohen, the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, to be the voice of sanity to debate him. The same Southern Poverty Law Center that says people like Ben Carson and Ayaan Hirsi Ali are hateful extremists. The same Southern Poverty Law Center that counts self-reported social media incidents as hate crimes. But surprisingly, Cohen does what I thought was a great job. You can watch the full debate linked in the description if you like, but for the purposes of this segment, I want to focus on how this Ivy League thinker justifies the use of violence to settle differences of political opinion.
Mark Bray, I'll start with you. You seem to be a very small minority here who is defending the idea of violence, considering that somebody died in Charlottesville Why do you defend confronting in a violent way?
Well, first, I would contest the notion that I'm that small of a minority. I think that a lot of people recognize that when pushed, self-defense is a legitimate response to white supremacist and neo-Nazi violence. We've tried ignoring neo-Nazis in the past. We've seen how that turned out in the 20s and 30s, and the lesson of history is you need to take it with the utmost seriousness before it's too late. We've seen the millions of deaths that have come from not taking it seriously enough, and we can see that really the way that white supremacy grows, the way that neo-Nazism grows is by becoming legitimate, becoming established. And the way to stop that is what people did in Boston, what people did in Charlottesville. Pull the emergency brake and say, you can't make this normal.
Every one of these points requires massive conflation and blurring the lines between things that are crucial to distinguish. Point 1, he says self-defense is a legitimate response to neo-Nazi violence, and I agree, if you are physically attacked, you should be able to defend yourself. But almost never are we talking about Antifa responding to being attacked. We are talking about Antifa attacking in response to ideas. Bray is making a self-defense claim based on ideas, not actions. When you fail to distinguish between words and violence, violence becomes a justifiable response to words, as we are witnessing right now. Point 2, he says ignoring Nazis leads to their rise, pointing to 1920s and 30s Europe. How about we take a more relevant example instead of his worst-case scenario boogeyman? How about we take the last 5 or 6 decades of American history in which we have ignored the Nazis. Per the Supreme Court, we let them march in Skokie, and despite our indifference, they have had effectively zero political influence, and they have not held meaningful political office in that time frame. Emergency intervention is not necessary when nobody finds their ideas compelling anyway. Point 3, he conflates Boston and Charlottesville, lumping them in the same group, despite the fact that the Boston events organizers explicitly denounced racism. There weren't white supremacists or neo-Nazis in attendance in Boston, and the Boston events organizers spoke to the importance of protecting free speech as the alternative to violence. If you accept the premise of violent self-defense from words, and if you make no distinction between Boston and Charlottesville, you are establishing a standard that violence is a justifiable response to essentially any difference of opinion. If you like chunky peanut butter, I will absolutely punch you in self-defense. And you can take my pineapple pizza from my cold, dead hands, which of course you'd be totally justified in doing if you listen to this guy. After all, we cannot make this normal.
There's a big difference between confronting fascism and confronting other forms of violence. So we can see that during the 30s and 40s, there was no public opinion to be leveraged by nonviolent resistance. If you get fascists to be powerful enough in government, they're simply not going to listen to the kind of public opinion that nonviolence can generate. That's the argument for resistance to Nazis. And the other point that I'll make is that a lot of people don't have the choice whether they can defend themselves or not. We've seen that even before this sort of, as you called it, spiral of violence started, there were attacks on mosques, there were attacks on synagogues. A lot of people are under attack, and sometimes they need to be able to defend themselves. It's not, it's a privileged position to be able to say that you never have to defend yourself from these kinds of monsters.
Ooh, if the Nazis get political power, they won't uphold democratic values. Talk to me when the Nazis get political power. Talk to me when they hold a school board seat, let alone a seat in Congress, let alone a majority. And to his point on self-defense from attacks at religious sites, let's not forget plenty of those are verified hoaxes, and no claim like this should be taken at face value. But even if these attacks are real, the bad action of one individual doesn't mean you get to silence the speech of someone uninvolved merely because their ideas may overlap somewhat. If I write a harshly critical Yelp review of a restaurant and someone else robs that restaurant, you don't get to silence my critical speech in response.
The real enemies of free speech are fascists. We've seen that historically. We've seen that they're the ones that, if they have their way, will shut down speech. And It also differs in the sense that anti-fascists see this as a political struggle. They don't see fascism as a difference of opinion or as kind of a different perspective to consider. Instead, they see fascists as the enemy, and I think that we need to come around to that notion, considering that there is no doubt what they've done historically.
I've listened through this segment no less than 10 times, trying to understand the reasoning. The anti-fascists are the real heroes of free speech, and that's because they don't consider other viewpoints as differences of opinion. They view them as threats to be exterminated by force. The fascists are the ones who will shut down free speech if they have their way. Never mind that we do currently have our way and we do shut down free speech. Like, we did it just this last weekend. It was awesome. But if you care about free speech, you should worry what other people might do and disregard what we actually do. The debate closes with a crucial philosophical difference that we should all think about.
The answer to bad speech is more speech. We saw it in Boston yesterday.
Well, we've seen that fail historically. I mean, fascism cannot be defeated through speech. And we can also see that, Charlottesville did give attention to white supremacy, but it's not as if your average American can name any of the groups that were out there.
Consider those competing ideas. On the one side, you have the view that the answer to bad speech is good speech. And on the other side, you have the view that bad ideas cannot be defeated by speech. What's the distinction between these two perspectives? One believes in your ability and your right to decide for yourself what good ideas are versus bad, and the other believes you must be told. One perspective upholds the view that in an open marketplace of ideas, good ideas tend to rise. The other says you cannot reason for yourself, and you need an Ivy League self-proclaimed philosopher king to tell you which ideas belong in your head and which don't. Now, maybe you agree with the professor that fascism is a unique threat and something we should take seriously, but I bet you want to reach that conclusion through your own examination, your own consideration, not because this guy tells you what to believe and advocates the enforcement of his ideas through violence. This isn't a debate about what the correct ideas are. It's a debate about who decides what the correct ideas are. Do you decide that for yourself, or does somebody tell you? And Professor, if you're listening, I would love to hear your answer. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to come hang out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it.